There are castles that look old, castles that look rich, castles that look defensive, ceremonial, or grand. And then there is Neuschwanstein, a castle that looks like a lie so beautiful people volunteer to believe it. You see it on a ridge above the Bavarian landscape, white towers rising over dark forest and mountain air, and for a second the mind stops doing its job. It stops asking the sensible questions. It stops asking who built something like this in the 19th century, in an age of industry and bureaucracy and railways and rifles and ministries and modern war. It stops asking why this thing looks less like a residence than like a hallucination made permanent. And that pause, that surrender, is the first clue. Neuschwanstein was never meant to feel practical. It was meant to feel inevitable after the eye had already fallen in love with it. Long before people called it a fairy tale castle, long before tourists lined up for timed entries and cameras turned it into a global cliché, long before Disney borrowed its silhouette and mass culture flattened it into fantasy branding, Neuschwanstein began as something much stranger and more dangerous. A private answer to humiliation, loneliness, theatrical obsession, political powerlessness, spiritual yearning, and a monarch's inability to live comfortably inside the century that produced him. Because the brutal truth is this: Neuschwanstein is not merely a beautiful castle, it is a beautiful wound. It is what happens when longing gets money, stone, altitude, painters, engineers, and enough royal privilege to stop the ordinary world from interrupting for a while. It is what happens when a king loses faith in the real kingdom and starts constructing another one in symbols. And that is why the place still works. Not because it is simply lovely, and not because it is medieval, it isn't, but because it is emotionally overcharged. The building is carrying more than architecture. It is carrying retreat, compensation, delusion, vision, injury, nostalgia, sacred theatre, and one of history's most attractive unresolved questions. Was Ludwig II of Bavaria a mad king, a misunderstood aesthete, a politically trapped dreamer, or all three at once? The gossip starts almost immediately because Neuschwanstein invites gossip the way cliffs invite echoes. People say it was built by a lunatic. People say it bankrupted a kingdom. People say it was made for operas, for secret desires, for the king's private fantasies, for impossible versions of himself. People say Ludwig died by suicide. People say he was murdered. People say the castle is fake, and then spend half their lives staring at photographs of it. People dismiss it as kitsch and then, when they see it in person, fall silent like everyone else. That silence matters, because whatever else Neuschwanstein is, it is not weak. It overpowers cynicism more often than cynics would like to admit. So if we are going to stay with this castle for the full stretch, not as tourists, but as listeners willing to enter the machinery of the myth, then we have to do more than describe towers and rooms. We have to enter the emotional conditions that made such a place necessary. We have to go backward, into the childhood of Ludwig, into the painted walls of Hohenschwangau, into the swan legends and mountain air, into Richard Wagner's intoxicating universe of sacred longing and heroic sorrow, into Bavaria's political humiliation in the face of Prussia, into debt and scandal and psychiatry and a body in dark water. Because Neuschwanstein is not really explained by its stones, it is explained by the pressure that needed those stones. And the pressure began early. Before Ludwig II was the king who built impossible palaces, he was a boy raised in scenery already half converted into story. He grew up near Hohenschwangau Castle, a place that was not neutral in mood, not a plain royal residence training a future monarch in clear-eyed governance. Hohenschwangau had already been remade in a romantic neo-Gothic style by Ludwig's father, Maximilian II, and it was saturated with murals of legends, medieval heroes, swan imagery, and a cultivated atmosphere of poetic monarchy. This matters more than it may first seem. A child does not simply live among such images and remain untouched, especially not a child who is already sensitive, inward, and prone to intensity. Ludwig did not just see those images, he absorbed them as emotional reality. The legendary swan knight Lohengrin, medieval purity, suffering nobility, sacred kingship, the union of nature and myth, all of this entered him before politics ever had the chance to disappoint him properly. This is the first place where the lazy version of the story breaks apart. People like to imagine that one day Ludwig simply lost his grip and decided to build a fantasy castle because he was eccentric. But that makes the whole thing too sudden, too cheap, too easy. Neuschwanstein was not a bizarre interruption in an otherwise practical life. It was the flowering of patterns planted in childhood. The swan was not random decoration. The mountains were not just scenic background. The medieval legends were not wallpaper. They were a framework, a lens, a private atmosphere in which kingship meant something elevated, symbolic, and emotionally absolute. The young Ludwig was not being prepared merely to rule, he was being prepared, consciously or not, to feel monarchy as myth. And that becomes a problem when myth collides with history. As a child, Ludwig wandered through a world where nature seemed arranged for revelation. The alpine lakes, the forests, the ridges, the gorge, the long views across the Bavarian landscape, these were not merely beautiful. They were staged by culture to feel morally charged. One famous example sits almost insultingly close to the heart of the later story. The Marienbrücke, the bridge over the Perched gorge, from which the iconic view of Neuschwanstein would one day be seen, existed before the castle. The landscape was already teaching the eye how to receive a revelation that had not yet been built. The mountain already knew what to do with fantasy. Ludwig just had to supply the architecture. But childhood atmospheres alone do not produce castles. They produce susceptibility. They prepare the soul to be seduced by forms that promise total meaning. For Ludwig, the seduction would intensify the moment he became king. He inherited the Bavarian throne in 1864, at the age of 18. 18. That detail alone feels almost reckless. An age at which many people are still inventing themselves in fragments, still confusing beauty with truth, still vulnerable to whatever style first teaches them how to feel grandly. And suddenly he is a king. Not a clerk, not a student, not a harmless dreamer at the edge of power, but a young monarch in a Europe already changing faster than old monarchy could comfortably digest. If you want to understand how danger enters the story, this is one of the doors. Ludwig was young enough to still be ruled by atmosphere, and hungry enough to mistake intensity for destiny. Then came Richard Wagner. Wagner is one of those names that makes the whole 19th century start vibrating with incense, velvet, thunder, and ego. For Ludwig, Wagner was not just a composer whose music he admired. Wagner was confirmation. He was a system. He took legends that already haunted Ludwig's imagination and made them move, sing, suffer, redeem themselves, and return clothed in overwhelming emotion. Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, Parsifal, the Grail, purity tested by corruption, kingship shadowed by spiritual trial, redemption carried in art. Once Wagner entered Ludwig's inner life, the old symbols of childhood did not fade. They acquired voice, rhythm, and sacred urgency. This is where one of the most repeated lines about Neuschwanstein comes from, that it is essentially a giant Wagnerian dream in stone. The line contains truth, but not the whole truth. Yes, Wagner's influence is all over the castle's decorative program. Yes, the legendary subjects in its murals connect directly to the operatic universe that seized Ludwig's imagination. But Neuschwanstein is more than fan devotion. That interpretation is too small and too modern in the wrong way. As if Ludwig were just an obsessive cultural consumer with money. He was not only consuming Wagner, he was using Wagner to articulate a self he could not inhabit in ordinary political life. Wagner's works offered him an emotional and symbolic language for a kind of kingship that the real world increasingly refused to grant him. That distinction matters, because what Ludwig wanted was not art in the abstract. He wanted a reality worthy of the feelings art awakened in him. He wanted a world where kingship still glowed with sacred mystery, where landscape and architecture collaborated in revelation, where symbols were more than decorative taste, where the self could be elevated into legend and loneliness could be transfigured into destiny. That is why Neuschwanstein feels less like a home than like a test. It is an attempt to ask whether a life can be saved by being sufficiently aestheticized. The answer, as history would show, is no. But before that answer arrived, Ludwig had time to believe otherwise. Then came the humiliation that changed everything. In 1866, Bavaria sided with Austria against Prussia and lost. This was not just a military setback. For Ludwig, it was psychic damage. The defeat of Bavaria and the growing dominance of Prussia shrank the old political world, in which a king could still imagine himself sovereign in the full older sense. Bavaria's autonomy was reduced. The practical authority of the monarch was curtailed. He had inherited a crown, but the century was steadily hollowing out what that crown could mean. If childhood had taught him to feel kingship as a sacred calling, history now taught him that modern politics was perfectly willing to reduce kingship to an increasingly managed function. For a more robust, realistic ruler, this might have prompted adjustment, compromise, or a mature transition into constitutional limitation. For Ludwig, it produced pain, deep pain, the kind that does not stay politely in the realm of policy but seeps into identity. He had not wanted to be a decorative remnant inside a modernizing machine. He had wanted to reign in a world where symbols were still alive. And when the real kingdom failed him, another possibility began to harden. If he could not possess sovereignty in statecraft, perhaps he could possess it in space. If politics denied him the kingdom he imagined, he would make a kingdom that could not argue back. This is the hidden engine of Neuschwanstein. The castle was not simply a retreat from responsibility or an expensive hobby. It was compensation for the loss of sovereign reality. It was a replacement kingdom, a stage on which Ludwig could still be the sort of king he had been taught to inwardly expect. That is why the project begins to make sense precisely where it begins to look irrational. Ordinary practicality would never have produced Neuschwanstein. Wounded kingship could. Once you see that, the whole building changes character. The towers stop being decorative excess and start looking like an argument. The site on the ridge above the gorge stops being scenic preference and starts looking like psychological altitude. The white walls stop being charming and start feeling almost defensive, as if purity itself were trying to rise above contamination. This is no longer a story about a man who liked castles. It is the story of a man trying to rescue a version of reality from the century that was taking it apart. And there is something both magnificent and dangerous in that. Because architecture can console, but it can also amplify what already disturbs us. It can protect solitude, but it can also deepen it. It can make vision visible, but it can just as easily monumentalize obsession. Ludwig, unable to repair the fracture between inner monarchy and outer politics, turned to stone. Then came the act of designing the impossible. Neuschwanstein was not conceived first as a practical architectural plan. Its earliest visual conception came from the painter Christian Jank, a theatrical designer. And that fact tells you almost everything. The castle did not begin as a careful adaptation of medieval defensive logic, or even as a sober revivalist residence. It began as image, as scene, as visual spell. Later, architects like Eduard Riedel, Georg von Dollmann, and Julius Hofmann translated that theatrical imagination into buildable plans. But the origin remained visible. Neuschwanstein was designed with the DNA of stagecraft. It wanted to be seen, approached, revealed, framed, and emotionally received. It wanted to feel like the curtain rising on a dream that had always existed somewhere just beyond ordinary reach. That is why even today the castle looks slightly unreal in photographs. Not because photographs distort it, but because it was born with a painter's logic. It understands silhouette. It understands distance. It understands revelation through approach. It understands the emotional power of appearing at the right angle, above the right void, against the right light. The mountain did not simply host Neuschwanstein, it performed it. Construction began in 1869, and like so many great dreams, the project immediately entered into conflict with time, money, engineering, and the stubborn refusal of reality to obey atmosphere. Ludwig wanted speed. Reality gave him scaffolding. The gatehouse was completed first. The main structure rose slowly. A topping-out ceremony took place in 1880. Yet the project remained far from complete. Ludwig would die in 1886, and only a limited number of rooms would be finished to the level originally intended. Huge elements remained unrealized, simplified, or permanently incomplete. This, too, feels almost perfect in the most painful way. Of course, a castle born from longing would remain unfinished. Completion belongs to practical systems, to disciplined institutions, to projects aligned with ordinary purpose. Neuschwanstein belonged to a mind that did not live on ordinary terms. Its incompletion is not just a historical detail, it is part of the castle's emotional truth. It leaves the whole place suspended between plan and apparition, between promise and failure, between fulfillment and deficit. Even as a global icon, Neuschwanstein is slightly haunted by what it never became. That incompletion matters because it mirrors Ludwig himself. He too remained suspended, between public king and private visionary, between symbolic certainty and political collapse, between operatic self-construction and administrative reality. The castle is unfinished because the life behind it never reached resolution. And yet, for all its obsession with the medieval, Neuschwanstein was never intended as an authentic medieval life. This is one of the most revealing and quietly funny facts about the whole project. Ludwig did not want historical accuracy in the harsh sense. He wanted the emotional and symbolic effect of the Middle Ages without the filth, discomfort, danger, or inconvenience. So behind its romantic revival exterior, the castle contained modern technologies. Running water, central heating, flush toilets, hot water systems, bells, service mechanisms, technical efficiencies. In other words, Ludwig wanted fantasy supported by modern infrastructure. He wanted enchantment without surrendering convenience. And that makes Neuschwanstein very modern indeed. Modern people do this constantly. They crave the feeling of the past while quietly demanding all the hidden systems of the present. Ludwig just did it at a royal scale and with far better scenery. Inside, the castle's finished rooms make the psychology unmistakable. The throne hall, with its sacred atmosphere and Byzantine resonance, was conceived less as a political chamber than as a sanctified environment for kingship elevated beyond ordinary governance. The Singers' Hall invoked courtly legend and medieval idealism. The murals did not merely decorate the rooms. They surrounded Ludwig with narratives in which purity, trial, sacred destiny, and symbolic nobility could still feel real. This was not ordinary interior design. This was environmental reinforcement. The rooms did not just house the king, they told him who he was supposed to be. And that is why Neuschwanstein can feel both intimate and inhuman at once. Intimate because it was built to suit one man's inner mythology. Inhuman because that mythology demanded spaces too symbolic to feel ordinary. This was not a palace of small conversations, family warmth, practical hosting, or adaptable daily life. It was a palace of curated atmosphere. The scale of loneliness inside such beauty is hard to overstate. These rooms were not made to support common life. They were made to elevate isolation until it resembled destiny. Now we arrive at money, because beauty always gets uglier when bills appear. One of the most repeated accusations against Ludwig is simple and satisfying. He ruined Bavaria with his fantasy castles. It is an accusation with moral bite, and like most memorable accusations, it is a little too neat. Ludwig absolutely spent enormous sums. He borrowed heavily. His ministers became increasingly alarmed. The scale of his architectural projects became politically explosive. Those parts are real, but the popular line that he casually emptied the Bavarian state treasury for personal whims flattens the financial reality. Much of his spending involved his own royal income, civil list resources, and debts rather than the cartoonishly simple image of a king directly looting public funds. Still, that does not make the situation harmless. Debt is pressure, whether the money comes from the treasury or from borrowing against future means. And Ludwig was not spending like a man with a clear break. This is the part where the story becomes less sentimental. Neuschwanstein was beautiful, yes, but beauty does not absolve recklessness. Ludwig's ministers were not inventing the financial danger out of pure malice. The debts were serious. The political consequences were real. Yet to leave it there is still too easy. Because for Ludwig, the castles were not ornamental extras. They were existential structures. Telling him to scale back was not the same as telling a normal ruler to moderate decorative taste. It meant asking him to stop externalizing the world in which he could still feel like a true king. That made compromise nearly impossible. His ministers saw financial irresponsibility. Ludwig felt ontological necessity. When those two perspectives collide, there is usually no elegant outcome. As the 1870s and 1880s went on, Ludwig withdrew further from conventional public life. He preferred night to day, privacy to court routine, atmosphere to state business. He ordered private performances. He cultivated elaborate nocturnal travel. He retreated into controlled environments where the real world could be softened, delayed, or symbolically rewritten. This is the point where the gossip about him becoming stranger and stranger contains undeniable truth. But even here, the temptation to reduce the whole thing to colorful eccentricity misses the darker logic underneath. Ludwig was not just getting odd for the sake of oddness. He was constructing a life increasingly compatible with his inner world and increasingly incompatible with political expectation. That incompatibility would later be used against him. The label that history handed him, the Mad King, is one of the stickiest and dirtiest in the entire story. It is dramatic, easy to remember, and suspiciously convenient. Was Ludwig eccentric? Clearly. Was he isolated, obsessive, emotionally intense, and increasingly detached from ordinary public conduct? Yes. Did he struggle to function as the kind of ruler his age required? Absolutely, but mad does a lot of work too quickly. It folds complexity into spectacle. It allows bureaucracy to pose as sanity. It converts a politically difficult and psychologically unusual monarch into a carnival exhibit. The events of 1886 made that label even more poisonous. Ludwig was declared unfit to rule on the basis of a psychiatric assessment assembled without a direct clinical examination by the lead physician, Bernhard von Gudden, relying instead on reports, testimonies, observations, and accumulated evidence from others. That alone should make anyone suspicious of clean certainty. None of this proves Ludwig was healthy. It does not erase his withdrawal, his habits, his oddity, his judgment failures, or the alarming patterns that worried those around him. But it does complicate the authority of the diagnosis. It opens the door to another possibility, that what was called madness was partly a medicalized removal of an increasingly unmanageable king. And because Ludwig's private emotional and possibly sexual life has long been surrounded by tension and speculation, the waters are even muddier. He was deeply religious, intensely self-conscious, morally severe toward himself, attracted to symbolic purity, and emotionally lonely. It is not hard to imagine internal conflict of a kind his era could neither understand nor tolerate well. But here, honesty matters. Some claims can be grounded in letters, diaries, and observed patterns. Others remain gossip. The important point for Neuschwanstein is not lurid tabloid curiosity. It is that Ludwig's internal life appears to have been under serious pressure. Pressure that made symbolic architecture more than a taste preference. It made it a refuge. That refuge, however, did not save him. As Ludwig's isolation deepened and his debts mounted, the political structure around him hardened. He had become a problem, not just because he spent too much, but because he refused the script of manageable kingship. He was too theatrical to be administrative, too private to be public, too symbolic to be modern in the approved way. Neuschwanstein, for admirers, was proof of vision. For enemies, it was evidence. Every tower could be read as beauty or pathology, depending on what one needed from the story. Then came the fall. In June 1886, Ludwig was effectively deposed. He was declared incapable of ruling and taken into custody. Reports of his reaction convey shock, protest, and disbelief. One almost hears the rawness of it. How can men pronounce me insane without even examining me properly? Whether every phrase is preserved with perfect fidelity matters less than the overall shape. Ludwig did not experience this as an orderly constitutional necessity. He experienced it as violation. And then the story takes its darkest turn. On the evening of June 13, 1886, Ludwig and Dr. von Gudden went for a walk near Lake Starnberg. They did not return alive. Later, both bodies were found in the water. The official verdict was suicide by drowning, with Gudden dying in the struggle. That is the version history can print cleanly. But the details never settled comfortably. The depth of the water, the condition of Ludwig's body, the speed with which the whole thing became official, the political convenience of his death so soon after deposition, all of this fed suspicions that never went away. Was it suicide, a desperate escape attempt, a confrontation gone wrong, murder? There is no definitive proof for the more dramatic theories, but there is also no emotionally satisfying closure. And because there is no closure, the myth machine never stopped. That unresolved death matters profoundly for Neuschwanstein. Had Ludwig died peacefully in old age after finishing his castle, the building would still be astonishing, but it would not carry this same voltage. Mystery has a way of electrifying beauty. The unfinished palace, the contested diagnosis, the lake, the dead king, the dead doctor, the missing certainty, all of it feeds back into the castle, making every tower seem slightly more spectral. Neuschwanstein is not merely associated with Ludwig's life, it is haunted by the way that life ended without clear resolution. And here comes one of the cruelest facts of all. For all the obsession, expense, and emotional necessity invested in Neuschwanstein, Ludwig spent only a very limited amount of time actually living there. The dream refuge was barely inhabited by its dreamer. That almost feels unbearable in its irony. He built a kingdom for his own soul and hardly had time to use it before history closed in. Then, almost immediately after his death, the unfinished castle was opened to the public. Think about that. The man who built spaces for private symbolic kingship, for solitude, for curated atmosphere, for emotional shelter from the vulgarity of ordinary reality, was barely gone before strangers began filing through. The refuge became a destination. The solitude became a route map. There is a violence in that transformation, even if it was practical and inevitable. Ludwig sought insulation. History converted his insulation into access. It is one of the bitterest reversals in the whole story. The castle that was supposed to shield a singular inner life was almost at once turned into public consumption, and consumption did not stop. It grew. Neuschwanstein became one of the most famous castles in the world. It helped shape the modern visual vocabulary of fantasy. Yes, Disney's fairy tale castle imagery is strongly associated with Neuschwanstein. Yes, the place became a postcard kingdom for millions who know almost nothing about the real Ludwig, except perhaps that he was strange and tragic. Yes, the image has been flattened, reproduced, commercialized, and turned into dream material for people with no interest in Bavarian constitutional history or 19th century romanticism. And yet, and this is important, the castle survives that flattening better than many icons do. It still overpowers cliché when seen in person. It still pulls something old and embarrassingly sincere out of people. Or, that word modernity likes to pretend it has outgrown. Why? Because Neuschwanstein cheats brilliantly. It uses altitude. It uses theatrical approach. It uses contrast between white walls and dark roofs, between stone and forest, between apparent medieval purity and alpine vastness. It offers the eye exactly what the eye wants from fantasy, while still being made of real materials in a real place with a real history. It is not just an image, it is an image anchored in landscape. That combination is potent. A fantasy floating in nowhere eventually feels thin. A fantasy perched over a real gorge in a real mountain world acquires gravity. But the deeper reason it still works is that Neuschwanstein is built out of contradiction without collapsing under it. It is fake medieval and emotionally sincere. It is unfinished and globally iconic. It is private in origin and public in destiny. It is devout in atmosphere and theatrical in design. It is a reaction against modernity that became one of modernity's most marketable images. It is kitsch in the mouths of people who have not stood before it and devastating in the eyes of many who have. Contradictions usually weaken things. In this case, they feed it. Critics sometimes sneer that Neuschwanstein is not a real medieval castle, and of course it isn't. That criticism lands with all the force of announcing that opera is not documentary. The building was never trying to be an archaeological record. It was trying to be a 19th century dream of the Middle Ages, filtered through wounded monarchy, Wagnerian atmosphere, spiritual symbolism, and personal escape. Judge it by the wrong standard, and you can dismiss it cheaply. Judge it by the right one, and it becomes far more unsettling. The relevant question is not whether it is authentic medieval architecture. The relevant question is what it reveals about the modern need to reinvent the past when the present becomes emotionally intolerable. On that question, Neuschwanstein is almost too revealing. It tells us that people do not turn to fantasy merely because they are childish. They turn to it when reality feels spiritually insufficient, politically humiliating, emotionally unbearable, or simply too reduced to house the scale of their longings. Ludwig's version of that move was extreme, privileged, and architecturally magnificent. But the impulse itself is recognizable. He could not accept the shrinking of kingship into procedural modernity. He could not bear the loss of symbolic fullness. He could not comfortably inhabit a world in which his crown had less metaphysical substance than his imagination demanded. So he built, and in building, he tried to create a zone where the old language of transcendence could still feel materially present. There is something tragic in that effort, because it was both profound and doomed. Architecture can embody aspiration, but it cannot indefinitely shelter a human being from political reality or mental suffering. A castle can surround you with symbols of divine kingship and sacred solitude, but it cannot prevent debt notices. It cannot silence ministers. It cannot resolve internal conflict. It cannot stop a century from becoming itself. Ludwig poured meaning into Neuschwanstein, but meaning is not a fortress. And yet to call the project a failure is also too simple. Ludwig failed, if we must use that word, as a practical ruler of his age. He failed to stabilize his position. He failed to control the consequences of his obsessions. He failed to save himself. But as an architect of longing, as a man who materialized wounded grandeur so convincingly that the world still travels to stare at it, he was almost terrifyingly successful. Few private fantasies have ever entered public imagination with such force. That leads to a harder question. Did Ludwig create Neuschwanstein, or did Neuschwanstein, once conceived, begin to create the Ludwig the world remembers? There is a way in which the castle retroactively organizes his myth. It gives shape to his contradictions. Without Neuschwanstein, he might remain a troubled and fascinating 19th-century monarch, but not quite this unforgettable. The castle sharpened his legend. It made his sensitivities visible. It gave his loneliness architecture. It turned his compensations into skyline. And once that happened, every later event, the diagnosis, the deposition, the death at the lake, fed back into the building, making it not merely one of Ludwig's projects, but his psychological portrait in stone. That portrait is not clinically exact. No building can diagnose a person, but it can reveal. And Neuschwanstein reveals a mind that needed purity, distance, atmosphere, and symbolic saturation. It reveals a ruler who preferred the language of legend to the language of politics. It reveals a soul unable to live lightly. Every part of the castle says the same thing in different forms. The ordinary world was not enough. And maybe that is why it still grips people in an age that prides itself on disenchantment. Many visitors do not know the details of Bavarian statehood in the 1860s. They do not know the names of the architects or the sequence of the building phases. They may barely know who Ludwig was. Yet they feel something, a kind of ache, a kind of impossible promise. They call it fairy tale because that is the easiest available word. But fairy tale is too soft. What they are really feeling is longing staged as inevitability. They are feeling the emotional logic of escape. There is a darker edge to this too, because fairy tales are not always happy, and castles are not always symbols of safety. Sometimes they are monuments to the inability to live elsewhere. Neuschwanstein is radiant, but it is not carefree. Its beauty has strain in it. Its whiteness has insistence. Its elevation has withdrawal. It is lovely the way certain arias are lovely, magnificently, yes, but with pressure building underneath. You can admire it as a postcard if you want, but the deeper story is harder to keep decorative. The castle exists because one man could not reconcile himself to the world as it had become. That is not a neutral origin. It leaves a trace. And still the trace is not merely tragic. It is also weirdly victorious. Ludwig did not finish the castle. He did not enjoy it for long. He did not survive his political enemies, his debts, or whatever inner fractures sharpened his need for symbolic refuge. But the building survived him. More than that, it conquered the imagination on a scale none of his practical critics could have matched. The men who judged him irresponsible are now footnotes beside towers tourists recognize instantly. That does not erase the reality of his problems, but it complicates triumph. History did not simply vindicate Ludwig, it converted him. It took the private dream and made it public legend. In recent years, the recognition has only deepened. In 2025, Neuschwanstein, along with Ludwig II's other palaces, received UNESCO World Heritage status. Institutions now present what once looked to many contemporaries like dangerous excess as a globally significant cultural inheritance. That does not mean the controversies disappear. It means the world has decided that whatever madness, vision, folly, or pain generated these places, the result belongs to collective human memory. There is an almost cruel elegance in that. The king who built private dream worlds because public reality failed him has been absorbed into official heritage, catalogued, preserved, visited, interpreted, institutionalized. Even now, the system has the last administrative word. But the image still belongs to Ludwig more than to the system. And perhaps the final reason Neuschwanstein remains inexhaustible is that it never fully answers the question at its heart. Was this castle a triumph or a symptom? A masterpiece or a compensatory delusion? A spiritual refuge or a luxurious trap? An act of artistic sovereignty or of psychological retreat? The honest answer is yes. All of it. It is precisely because the building refuses reduction that it stays alive. Simplify Ludwig into a mad king, and the castle becomes merely evidence. Simplify him into a misunderstood genius, and the debts, collapse, and suffering become sentimental blur. The truth is more uncomfortable. Neuschwanstein is beautiful because it came out of contradiction severe enough to generate beauty at that scale. Maybe that is why the image endures so aggressively. It is not merely charming, it is overdetermined. Too many things are happening inside it at once: childhood memory, Wagnerian myth, wounded sovereignty, religious symbolism, technological modernity, wearing medieval costume, debt, retreat, artistry, scandal, death, commercialization, survival. Every tower carries multiple stories. Every view from the bridge is a visual lie that tells an emotional truth. Yes, the castle was never medieval, but perhaps it was always more honest than a fully practical building would have been. It admits, without shame, that human beings will build impossible things rather than accept reality on reduced terms. That admission may be the most modern thing about it, because we still do this, not with castles perhaps, but with curated lives, aestheticized selves, nostalgic brands, digital dreamscapes, luxury enclaves, private symbols, emotional architectures of all kinds. We still try to build worlds that feel truer to us than the public one. We still respond to humiliation by seeking controlled environments. We still use beauty as insulation. Ludwig's version was extreme, but not alien. That may be why his castle continues to draw people who know nothing of him. They are responding to something older than historical knowledge. They are responding to the human urge to live inside a version of reality that does not feel diminished. But there is always a price. There was for Ludwig. The replacement kingdom can never fully replace. The private theatre cannot stop history from entering. The symbols cannot forever outvote ministers, creditors, physicians, and political opportunists. Sooner or later, the real world collects. In Ludwig's case, it collected hard, and that is what gives Neuschwanstein its final ache. The dream was not enough to save the dreamer. The structure outlived the life. The myth outlived the man. When people stand at Marienbrücke and look toward the castle, they often think they are seeing fulfillment. In a way, they are seeing the opposite. They are seeing the shape of a need that could never be fully met. They are seeing a king's answer to powerlessness, and the answer is so visually convincing that it hides the desperation that made it necessary. The mountain, the white stone, the towers, the immense calm of the composition, all of it says completion. But the history underneath says fracture. That tension is the real spell. Neuschwanstein looks complete while being born from incompletion. It looks serene while emerging from conflict. It looks eternal while carrying the mark of a brief and troubled life. And perhaps that is why the castle has such an afterimage. You do not leave it behind easily. Even in memory, it keeps hovering. Not just as beauty, but as a question. What do people build when reality no longer feels worthy of them? What does grandeur become when stripped of practical sovereignty? How much loneliness can a building absorb? How much longing can architecture hold before it turns from shelter into monument? There are no clean answers. Neuschwanstein does not provide them. It stands above the gorge and keeps asking instead. So in the end, perhaps the most honest way to speak about Neuschwanstein is this. It is not merely a castle you look at, it is a confession you can walk through, though the confessor is long dead and the most important parts were never spoken plainly. It confesses hunger for purity, it confesses inability to adapt, it confesses the use of beauty against pain. It confesses the need to place oneself inside a story grand enough to justify one's own intensity. It confesses, too, the fatal weakness of that strategy. Because beauty can transfigure experience, but it cannot abolish the terms of existence. Not even for a king. And yet, that is still not the whole story, because the building refuses to stay inside tragedy alone. It continues to seduce. It continues to inspire. It continues to produce wonder in people who know perfectly well that it is historical theatre. That is part of its power, too. Neuschwanstein does not ask for innocence from the viewer. You can know it is invented, romanticized, modern, incomplete, and psychologically charged, and it still gets you. Perhaps more deeply then. Because once the facts are known, the beauty becomes stranger, not weaker. You realize you are not looking at naive fantasy. You are looking at fantasy forged under pressure. You are looking at the polished exterior of a wound that refused to stay invisible. The more one stays with Ludwig, the harder it becomes to dismiss him, and the harder it becomes to excuse him fully. He was too complicated for either contempt or sentimental rescue. He could be extravagant, irresponsible, impossible, and painfully sincere. He could evade reality and perceive something about beauty that practical men never do. He could fail in public terms and succeed in symbolic ones so completely that the success itself feels almost accusatory. Look, the castle says, look what private obsession can make while ordinary statecraft is forgotten. That is not an argument ministers enjoy hearing from history. And still history, which is rarely merciful, gave Ludwig the most ambivalent victory imaginable. It let him lose everything essential to life: authority, stability, time, safety, perhaps peace of mind, and then handed immortality to the image born from that loss. The dream won, but too late for the dreamer. That is the bleak magnificence of Neuschwanstein. It turns defeat into silhouette. It turns compensation into icon. It turns a man's inability to live in his century into one of the century's most enduring fantasies. So when the mist rises around the towers at dawn, or when the sunset catches the walls and turns them briefly gold, or when winter lays silence over the ridge and the whole castle looks as if it has withdrawn not just from the world, but from time itself, remember what is actually standing there. Not a medieval relic, not a simple monument to luxury, not a harmless fairy tale. What stands there is an answer, one man's answer, to the collapse of a meaningful world. Whether that answer was noble, delusional, tragic, visionary, childish, profound, or fatally all of them together is precisely why the castle will not let people stop talking. And perhaps that is the last hook Neuschwanstein offers, the darkest one. We are used to thinking of castles as symbols of power, but Neuschwanstein is a symbol of powerlessness, transformed into spectacle. It is what a king builds when ruling no longer feels real enough. It is what loneliness looks like when it has access to genius-level image control. It is what happens when myth is used not merely to decorate life, but to defend it from a truth it cannot bear. That defense failed. Ludwig died. The dream kingdom did not protect him. The lake kept its silence. The doctors, ministers, servants, and later historians all got their turn at shaping the story. Yet still, above all of them, the castle remains. Brilliant, incomplete, impossible, white against the dark ridge, like a promise no century could honestly keep. And maybe that is why it still feels alive. Because it is not just preserving the past, it is preserving an unresolved human condition, the refusal to live entirely inside the world as given. Neuschwanstein is the monument to that refusal. It is its most seductive evidence and its warning. It whispers that beauty can redeem injury. It also whispers that beauty can become a prison if you ask it to do the work of reality. It offers transcendence and carries collapse inside it. It is a dream thick enough to cast shadow, and the shadow, once seen, never completely leaves the towers again. So yes, Neuschwanstein is stunning. Yes, it deserves every camera pointed at it. Yes, it looks like a palace from the edge of sleep. But underneath the glow is something far less innocent and far more interesting. Underneath the postcard lives a man who tried to answer humiliation with grandeur, emptiness with myth, and modern reduction with sacred theatre. He failed to save his life. He succeeded in saving an image. More than a century later, the image still wins the first battle every time. The eye falls in love before the mind can object. And perhaps that was Ludwig's final victory after all. Not a victory in politics, not in sanity, not in survival, but in seduction. He built a place that still makes people surrender even after they know better. A place that is not true in the literal medieval sense, but is devastatingly true in another one. True to longing, true to retreat, true to the dangerous human wish to live inside beauty when reality grows too thin. Neuschwanstein stands there still, above the gorge, above the village, above the ordinary, asking the same dark question it has always asked without words. If the real kingdom breaks, what will you build in its place? And that is why the castle remains unforgettable. Not because it solved that question, because it didn't, because it couldn't, because the failure is part of the light on the walls, because the unfinished dream is what made the dream endure, because somewhere in its white towers there is still the echo of a king who could not live lightly, could not rule plainly, could not stop dreaming on an imperial scale, and could not finally force the world to become worthy of his symbols, but came just close enough that the rest of us are still staring,